Whispers of Westbridge Academy. Westbridge Academy sat like a slumbering giant at the edge of a fog-drenched moor. Its Gothic spires pierced the sky, and the ivy that crept along the stone walls whispered in the cold wind. For centuries, the school had been a beacon of prestige and discipline, drawing students from across England. But the locals knew better. Beneath its grandeur lay dark secrets that no headmaster could erase. The students whispered about the ghost of Charlotte Ashcroft, a girl who had mysteriously vanished in 1892. Her name was scratched into desks and dormitory walls, a warning from generations past. Some said she had fallen victim to the moor's treacherous bogs, while others insisted she had never left the school at all. For Clara Milton, a new scholarship student, the whispers were just part of the school's lore. She didn't believe in ghosts. After all, she was here for one reason: to escape her suffocating life in Manchester and to secure her future. The carriage rattled along the cobblestone path leading to Westbridge Academy. The driver, a gaunt man with a voice like gravel, had been uncharacteristically silent during the journey. Clara, clutching her suitcase, peered out the window as the towering gates came into view. "Almost there," the driver muttered. His tone was flat, but his hands tightened on the reins. The gates groaned open, revealing the school's expansive grounds. Statues of angels lined the walkway, their eyes hollow and their stone hands clutching what looked like broken swords. The main building loomed ahead, its arched windows glowing faintly in the fading daylight. Clara stepped out of the carriage, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was colder here, and the wind carried the scent of decaying leaves. She adjusted her scarf and made her way toward the entrance, where the headmistress, Miss Hargrove, stood waiting. Miss Hargrove was a severe-looking woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. "Welcome to Westbridge Academy, Miss Milton," she said briskly. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the driver's silence had been anything but ordinary. The headmistress led Clara through the grand foyer, where chandeliers cast fractured light across the polished floors. Portraits of stern-faced men and women lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow Clara as she walked past. "Your dormitory is in the East Wing," Miss Hargrove said, her heels clicking against the floor. "Breakfast is at 7 sharp. Classes begin at 8. Do not wander the halls at night." The last sentence hung in the air like a warning. Clara frowned but nodded. Miss Hargrove stopped in front of a wooden door. "This will be your room. Supper is served in the dining hall at 6. Do try to be punctual." Clara stepped inside, her suitcase feeling heavier than before. The room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a window that overlooked the moor. She unpacked her belongings quickly, eager to explore the school before dinner. As she turned to leave, she noticed something etched into the wooden frame of the mirror above her desk. Say 1892. She traced the initials with her finger, a chill running down her spine. Clara barely touched her supper that evening. The dining hall was vast, with long wooden tables and a high ceiling adorned with cobwebbed chandeliers. The other students chatted in hushed tones, their voices echoing faintly. She couldn't stop thinking about the initials in her room. Who was CA? Was it Charlotte Ashcroft? After dinner, Clara returned to her dormitory. The hallways were eerily quiet, and the flickering gas lamps cast long, dancing shadows. She hurried back to her room, shutting the door firmly behind her. Sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight. Clara turned over in her bed, pulling the covers tighter around her. And then she heard it, a faint whisper. First, she thought it was the wind, but as she strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. "Help me!" Clara sat bolt upright, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice was coming from the mirror. Clara stared at the mirror, her breath caught in her throat. The surface of the glass shimmered faintly, almost as if it were alive. "Help me!" The voice came again, soft yet insistent. It was a girl's voice, fragile but filled with desperation. Clara clutched the edge of her blanket, her mind racing. Perhaps it was just her imagination, a trick of exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere. But as she inched closer to the mirror, her reflection seemed off. The room behind her was the same, her desk and chair visible in the reflection. Yet the reflection of Clara herself seemed faintly distorted, her features blurred. "Who's there?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The mirror rippled like water disturbed by a stone. For a moment, Clara thought she saw a face, young, pale, with hollow eyes. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Find me," the voice whispered. And then the mirror stilled, reflecting only Clara's pale face and wide eyes. The next morning, Clara couldn't concentrate during her classes. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the mirror and the strange voice. Who was the girl? And what did she mean by "find me"? After her last lesson, Clara decided to visit the school library. If there was any record of Charlotte Ashcroft, or anyone else who might be connected to the initials, she'd find it there. The library was a sprawling maze of towering shelves and dusty tomes. The librarian, an elderly man with a stooped back and clouded eyes, barely glanced at her as she entered. "Excuse me," Clara said hesitantly, approaching the desk. "I'm looking for information about a student named Charlotte Ashcroft. She was here in 1892. The librarian's hands froze mid-motion. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Charlotte Ashcroft," he murmured almost to himself. "A tragic case. Best left forgotten." Clara frowned. "What happened to her?" The librarian shook his head. "Some things are better left in the past, child. Curiosity can be dangerous in a place like this." He gestured toward the far corner of the library. "If you insist, the school records are there. But tread carefully." Clara thanked him and made her way to the records section. The air seemed colder here, and the dim light from the lamps barely illuminated the rows of old ledgers and yearbooks. She found the ledger from 1892 and opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling under her touch. Scanning the list of names, she found it, Charlotte Ashcroft. Beside her name, the word missing was scrawled in red ink. No explanation, no details, just that one haunting word. As Clara turned the page, a slip of paper fell out. It was a torn piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Scrawled on it in a shaky hand were the words, "She is still here. The East Wing holds the truth." The East Wing was off-limits to students, supposedly due to structural instability. But as Clara stood outside the roped-off entrance that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that the note was meant for her. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, and slipped under the rope. The air in the East Wing was colder, heavier, as though the very walls held secrets they were desperate to keep. Dust coated the floor, and broken furniture lay scattered across the halls. The faint scent of mildew and decay lingered in the air. Clara moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of grime. She passed empty classrooms and abandoned dormitories, their doors hanging ajar. Shadows seemed to shift at the edge of her vision, but whenever she turned, there was nothing there. Finally, she reached a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, it was intact, its surface polished and unmarked by time. Clara hesitated before turning the handle. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished. A single desk stood in the center, and on it lay a mirror. Clara's breath hitched. The mirror was identical to the one in her dormitory, its surface gleaming unnaturally despite the lack of light. As she stepped closer, the glass rippled, and the same face she'd seen the night before appeared. This time it didn't vanish. "Charlotte," Clara whispered. The face nodded. Her lips moved, forming words that Clara couldn't hear. "Speak louder," Clara urged, her heart pounding. Charlotte's eyes widened, and her expression turned frantic. Her hands pressed against the inside of the glass as though trying to break free. And then Clara heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from behind her. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The growl was deep and unnatural, reverberating through the abandoned corridor behind her. She turned slowly, her breath catching as the shadows seemed to shift and twist, forming something alive. The creature stepped into the faint light leaking from the room. Its body was hunched, its long, clawed fingers scraping against the floor as it moved. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was filled with jagged, uneven teeth that seemed too large for its face. Clara stumbled back, nearly tripping over the desk. Her eyes darted to the door, but the creature moved to block her path, its growl deepening. "Charlotte, what do I do?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The mirror rippled again, and Charlotte's voice came, louder this time. "It won't hurt you if you stay still." Clara's knees felt like they might give out, but she obeyed, remaining perfectly still as the creature sniffed the air around her. Its claws scraped closer, the sound making her skin crawl. She could feel its rancid breath on her neck, hot and putrid. It sniffed her once more, then let out a guttural snarl and retreated into the shadows. The moment it was gone, Clara collapsed to the floor, her hands trembling. "Why is this happening?" she asked, her voice breaking. Charlotte's reflection in the mirror looked pained. "Because you're the only one who can help me. It won't stop until you do." "Help you with what?" Clara demanded, her frustration and fear boiling over. Charlotte hesitated, her form flickering. "Free me. My spirit is trapped here. In the East Wing. You must find the locket." "What locket?" Clara asked, but the mirror went still again, Charlotte's face disappearing into darkness. Clara didn't sleep that night. The memory of the creature and Charlotte's plea replayed in her mind over and over. She couldn't ignore it. She had to find the locket, whatever it was. The next morning, as she walked to breakfast, she was intercepted by Miss Hargrove. The headmistress's stern expression seemed even harsher today, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Milton, may I have a word?" she asked, though it was more of a command than a request. Clara followed her to the office, her stomach churning with unease. Miss Hargrove closed the door behind them and turned to Clara, her piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "You were seen near the East Wing last night," she said coldly. "That part of the school is forbidden for a reason." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Hargrove held up a hand. "Do not lie to me. I know you went inside." I didn't mean to cause trouble," Clara stammered. "I just wanted to." "To what? Chase after ghosts?" Miss Hargrove interrupted, her tone icy. "Listen to me carefully, Miss Milton. Whatever you think you saw, it is not your concern. The East Wing is dangerous, and you are forbidden to return there. Do you understand?" Clara hesitated. She thought about the growling creature, about Charlotte's desperate plea. "But, do you understand?" Miss Hargrove repeated, her voice sharp. "Yes, ma'am," Clara mumbled, though she had no intention of obeying. As she left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Hargrove knew more than she was letting on. That evening, Clara waited until the dormitory was silent before slipping out of bed. She carried a small flashlight she'd hidden in her suitcase, the beam cutting through the darkness as she made her way back to the East Wing. The rope blocking the entrance was still there, but Clara ducked under it again, her determination outweighing her fear. This time, she explored the wing more thoroughly, checking every door and corner for clues. The air felt heavier the farther she ventured, as though the building itself was resisting her presence. In one of the abandoned classrooms, she found a loose floorboard near the teacher's desk. Kneeling down, she pried it open and found a small leather-bound journal inside. The journal belonged to Charlotte Ashcroft. Clara flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about classes, complaints about strict teachers, but the final pages were different. "I've seen the shadow again. It follows me in the halls, always just out of reach. Miss Hargrove says I'm imagining things, but I know it's real. I can feel its eyes on me. I can't trust anyone here. They're all lying. The locket is the only way to stop it, but I don't know where it is. I think Miss Hargrove hid it in the chapel." The last entry was scrawled in frantic handwriting. "If anyone finds this, please, don't let it take you to. Find the locket. Free me." Clara closed the journal, her heart pounding. The chapel. That's where she needed to go. The chapel was another part of the school rarely used, its grand doors locked except for special occasions. Clara wasn't sure how she'd get inside, but as she approached, she noticed one of the side windows was slightly ajar. Climbing through the window, she landed softly on the stone floor. The chapel was dark, the faint moonlight streaming through the stained glass casting eerie patterns on the walls. She made her way to the altar, where a small box rested. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with the initials CA. As soon as she touched it, the air grew colder, and the ground beneath her seemed to shake. A voice echoed through the chapel, low and guttural. "You should not have come here." Clara's grip on the locket tightened as the voice filled the chapel, reverberating through the stone walls like a thunderclap. She spun around, her flashlight flickering as the temperature plummeted. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, slithering along the floor like ink spreading through water. They gathered at the center of the chapel, rising and twisting into the form of the creature she had encountered before. Its yellow eyes burned like twin embers in its dark, shapeless mass. "You've taken what is mine," the voice growled, though the creature's mouth didn't move. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, rattling Clara's bones. "This isn't yours," Clara shouted, forcing herself to stand her ground. "It belongs to Charlotte." At the mention of the name, the creature let out an ear-splitting roar. The stained glass windows trembled, and one of them shattered, scattering shards across the cold floor. "She was mine," the creature hissed, its form twisting violently. "And so are you." Before Clara could react, the creature lunged. She threw herself to the side, the locket still clutched in her hand. The creature slammed into the altar, splintering the wood and sending debris flying. Clara scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. She remembered Charlotte's words. The locket is the only way to stop it. But how? The creature turned toward her, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You cannot save her. You cannot save yourself." Clara backed toward the door, her mind racing. She had to figure out how to use the locket. If she didn't, she'd never leave the chapel alive. The creature lunged again, and Clara darted behind a stone column. She could feel its presence, the air around her thick with malice. "Charlotte," Clara whispered, gripping the locket tightly. "What do I do?" The locket grew warm in her hand, and a faint voice echoed in her mind. "Open it." Clara fumbled with the tiny clasp, her fingers trembling as the creature's growls grew louder. At last, the locket snapped open, revealing a miniature portrait of a young girl with dark hair and sad eyes. A faint light began to emanate from the portrait, growing brighter with each passing second. The creature let out a shriek, recoiling as the light filled the chapel. "No!" it roared, its form flickering and distorting. "You cannot free her." The light from the locket grew stronger, illuminating the entire room. Clara felt a surge of warmth and strength flow through her as Charlotte's voice filled her mind again. "Hold it up. Don't let it go." Clara stepped out from behind the column, raising the locket high. The creature writhed and shrank, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a gale. "You don't belong here," Clara shouted, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Go back to wherever you came from." The creature let out one final, bone-chilling scream before it dissolved entirely, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The light from the locket dimmed, and Clara collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The chapel was eerily quiet now, the air no longer heavy with malice. "Charlotte," Clara whispered. The locket glowed faintly, and Charlotte's voice came again, soft and grateful. "You did it. You freed me." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "What happened to you? Why was that thing after you?" The locket grew warm again, and an image formed in Clara's mind. A memory, not her own. She saw Charlotte as a living girl, wandering the halls of Westbridge Academy. She saw the creature stalking her, drawn to her fear and loneliness. "It fed on me," Charlotte's voice explained. "It feeds on anyone it can trap. I tried to fight it, but Miss Hargrove, she didn't believe me. She took my locket, thinking it would protect the school. But all it did was trap my soul here. Clara's mind reeled. Miss Hargrove knew? She knew what was happening and did nothing. Charlotte's silence was answer enough. "What do I do now?" Clara asked. "Take the locket to the moor," Charlotte said. "Bury it where the ground meets the water. Only then will I be free." Clara left the chapel in the dead of night, the locket tucked safely in her pocket. The school was silent as she slipped through the halls and out into the cold night air. The moor stretched before her, dark and endless. The wind howled, carrying with it the distant cries of birds and the rustle of unseen creatures. Clara pressed on, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. At last, she reached the edge of the moor, where the ground grew soft and water pooled in shallow depressions. She knelt, digging into the damp earth with her hands. As she placed the locket in the hole, a sudden gust of wind swept through the moor, nearly knocking her over. The locket began to glow, its light seeping into the ground like golden tendrils. "Thank you," Charlotte's voice whispered, faint but filled with peace. "I'm free." The light faded, and the night grew still. Clara sat back, her hands trembling. For the first time since she'd arrived at Westbridge Academy, the air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. But as she made her way back to the school, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The creature might be gone, but the school still held its secrets, and Miss Hargrove still had answers to give. The next morning, Clara found herself standing outside Miss Hargrove's office, her fists clenched. She couldn't let this go. Not after everything she had seen, everything she now knew. The door creaked open before she could knock. Miss Hargrove stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Come in, Miss Milton," she said curtly, stepping aside to let Clara in. Clara hesitated, then walked into the room. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a quiet click, and Miss Hargrove gestured for her to sit. "I know what you've done," the headmistress said, her voice calm but edged with something sharp. Clara's stomach dropped. You knew about Charlotte, about the creature. You knew it was trapped here, and you let it happen." Miss Hargrove sighed, lowering herself into the chair behind her desk. "You don't understand the burden of running a place like this," she said. "This school has a history far older and darker than you realize. Keeping it standing requires sacrifices." Clara's eyes widened. "Sacrifices? You let that thing kill Charlotte. It wasn't supposed to kill her," Miss Hargrove snapped, her composure cracking. "The creature was bound to the east wing, feeding off fear, yes, but controlled. I thought taking her locket would keep it contained. But it didn't," Clara said, her voice rising. "You trapped her soul here instead." Miss Hargrove's face darkened. "And you? What have you done, Clara? Do you think burying the locket has solved anything?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Miss Hargrove leaned forward, her eyes cold. "That creature wasn't the only thing lurking in this school. You've disturbed a balance that's held for over a century. The East Wing. It's only the beginning." Clara left the office shaken, Miss Hargrove's words echoing in her mind. She had expected anger, even denial, but not this ominous warning. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The other students seemed oblivious to the tension brewing beneath the surface of Westbridge Academy, laughing and chatting in the hallways as though nothing had changed. But Clara noticed the difference. The air felt heavier again, and the shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it. A faint whispering coming from the walls. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Clara!" She sat up, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" The whispers didn't stop. They seemed to be coming from every corner of the room, overlapping and growing in intensity. "Free us," one voice said. "Help us," another pleaded. Clara's hands shook as she grabbed her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only the cold, empty room. "Charlotte," Clara whispered, though she knew the voice wasn't hers. The whispers faded, replaced by a single, clear voice. "The East Wing. The East Wing was forbidden. But Clara knew she had no choice. Whatever she had unleashed, it wasn't finished. She slipped out of her room and crept through the darkened halls, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. The school was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears and made her skin crawl. When she reached the east wing, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A door at the end of the corridor, hidden behind a tattered tapestry. It was old, much older than the rest of the building, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The air around it felt colder, as though it were pulling the warmth from the hallway. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the rusted handle. She thought of Charlotte, of the creature, of Miss Hargrove's cryptic warnings. And then she pushed the door open. The door led to a narrow staircase, spiraling downward into the earth. The air grew damp and heavy as Clara descended, the walls slick with moisture. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with objects that seemed to hum with a faint, malevolent energy. Books, trinkets, and artifacts that looked older than the school itself. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it rested a blackened, twisted mirror. Clara's breath hitched. The mirror's surface was unlike any she had seen before, swirling with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said behind her. Clara spun around to see Miss Hargrove standing at the base of the stairs, her face pale and her expression grim. "What is this place?" Clara demanded. Miss Hargrove's gaze flicked to the mirror. "This is the heart of Westbridge. Everything that has happened here. Every strange event, every disappearance. It all begins and ends with this." Clara stepped closer to the mirror, drawn to it despite the fear clawing at her chest. "What does it do?" "It's a gateway," Miss Hargrove said quietly. "A doorway to something far older and darker than you can imagine. And you've opened it." The shadows in the mirror began to swirl faster, and a low, echoing growl filled the chamber. Miss Hargrove grabbed Clara's arm. "We have to leave. Now." But Clara couldn't move. Her reflection in the mirror was staring back at her. Not with fear, but with a cold, knowing smile. The growling grew louder, and the shadows began to spill out of the mirror, twisting and coiling like living smoke. "Run!" Miss Hargrove shouted, but it was too late. The darkness consumed them. Clara awoke to darkness, thick, suffocating, and absolute. The air was heavy, pressing against her chest like a weight. For a moment, she thought she was still in the chamber beneath the school. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized she was somewhere else. The ground beneath her was cold and smooth, like polished obsidian, and the air buzzed with a low, droning hum that made her teeth ache. Shadows twisted and churned around her, forming strange shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. "Miss Hargrove," Clara called, her voice trembling. It echoed strangely, as if the space around her were endless. No response. She took a cautious step forward, her footsteps silent on the black ground. The droning hum seemed to grow louder, and she felt a strange pull, like invisible hands were dragging her toward something unseen. Ahead, a faint light flickered, pale and cold. Clara moved toward it, her heart pounding. The shadows seemed to part as she approached, revealing a figure standing in the glow. It was Miss Hargrove. "Headmistress," Clara called, relief flooding her voice. Miss Hargrove turned slowly, but something about her was wrong. Her eyes were blank, her face slack, as though she were a puppet on invisible strings. "You shouldn't have followed me," Miss Hargrove said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Now it sees you too." Clara froze. "What sees me?" Miss Hargrove's head tilted unnaturally, her blank eyes fixing on Clara. "The keeper of the mirror. It feeds on those who stray too close. You've become its next offering." Before Clara could respond, the ground beneath her shifted. The smooth obsidian cracked, and from the fissures poured a dark, viscous liquid that seemed alive, pooled around her feet, rising quickly. She tried to move, but the liquid clung to her, pulling her down. Miss Hargrove watched silently, her expression unchanged. "Help me!" Clara cried, struggling against the black substance. Miss Hargrove's lips parted in a chilling smile. "No one can help you now." The liquid dragged Clara down, and just as it reached her chest, the pale light around Miss Hargrove began to grow brighter. It was no longer cold, it was blinding, searing. A shape emerged from the light, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head crowned with twisting horns of shadow. Its eyes glowed white-hot, and its body seemed to ripple like smoke trapped in a storm. The Keeper. Clara couldn't look away as the being approached. The closer it came, the heavier the air grew, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. "You have taken what was not yours," the Keeper said, its voice 1,000 whispers layered into one. "You have disrupted the balance." "I didn't mean to," Clara gasped, her voice shaking. I was trying to help Charlotte." The Keeper's glowing eyes flickered. Charlotte Ashcroft was one of many. Her suffering was necessary to maintain the barrier. Clara's mind raced. The barrier? What barrier? The Keeper extended a clawed hand, pointing to the mirror hovering behind it. "This world and mine are separated by the veil. The mirror is the anchor. Sacrifices keep it sealed. You have weakened it." Clara's stomach dropped. I didn't know." The Keeper tilted its head, studying her. "Ignorance does not absolve you. The veil is fragile now, and the breach is widening. What was once contained will soon be free." The shadows around the Keeper began to writhe, taking on monstrous forms: eyes, mouths, claws. Clara realized with horror that they weren't just shadows. They were creatures, trapped in the space between worlds, clawing to escape. "What can I do?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Keeper leaned closer, its glowing eyes boring into hers. "The mirror must be destroyed, but to do so will come at a price." Clara felt the weight of the Keeper's words settle over her. "What price?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "The mirror requires a soul to remain stable," the Keeper said. "To destroy it, you must give it your own." Her breath caught. "You want me to die?" The Keeper's form flickered, its shadowy horns twisting. "Not death. An exchange. Your soul will bind the mirror and seal the veil. You will remain here, in the in-between, for eternity." Clara's heart pounded. The idea of being trapped in this dark, alien realm forever was almost too much to bear. But then she thought of the school, of the students who would be safe, of Charlotte and all the others who had suffered because of the mirror. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "If I do this, will it stop the creatures? Will it stop you?" The Keeper nodded slowly. "The veil will hold, and the balance will be restored." Clara closed her eyes. She didn't want to do this. She was terrified, but she couldn't let anyone else suffer because of her mistakes. "I'll do it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The Keeper extended its clawed hand. "Then take my hand, and it will be done." The moment Clara touched the Keeper's hand, a searing pain shot through her body. The shadows around her swirled violently, pulling her into the mirror. She felt herself being torn apart and stitched back together, her very essence becoming part of the glass. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer Clara Milton. She was the mirror. She could feel the school above her, the students walking its halls, oblivious to the danger that had once lurked beneath their feet. She could feel the creatures pressing against the veil, held at bay by her presence. Miss Hargrove's face appeared before her, looking older and wearier than Clara remembered. "You did well," the headmistress said softly. "The school is safe for now." Clara wanted to scream, to tell Miss Hargrove everything she had done wrong, but she couldn't. She was trapped, watching, waiting, ensuring the veil remained intact. And deep within the shadows of the mirror, the Keeper watched with her, its glowing eyes a constant reminder of the fragile balance she had sacrificed everything to protect. Years passed, and Westbridge Academy remained standing, its imposing stone walls untouched by time. The students came and went, laughing in the halls and studying late into the night, unaware of the darkness that had once threatened to consume their world. Miss Hargrove retired shortly after Clara's disappearance, her face etched with guilt and secrets she would never share. The new headmaster, a stern but kind man named Mr. Travers, dismissed the tales of hauntings as nothing more than fanciful school lore. The East Wing remained locked, its history buried beneath layers of dust and silence. But in the depths of the school, beneath the forbidden corridor, the mirror remained. It was hidden in the forgotten chamber, its surface smooth and dark as the void. Inside, Clara watched. She could see the school above her, the lives of its students playing out like a film projected onto the surface of her prison. She saw their fears, their hopes, their triumphs and failures. She wanted to reach out, to warn them, to tell them to stay away from the shadows. But she couldn't. She was no longer a person. She was the veil's guardian, a silent sentinel bound to the mirror for eternity. And though the veil held, Clara could feel the pressure of the darkness beyond. The creatures in the void were patient, their claws scraping faintly at the edges of her mind. She knew they would never stop trying to break through. But as long as she remained, they would never succeed. For Clara Milton was no longer afraid. She had become the shield that protected the world from the horrors beyond, the girl who sacrificed her freedom to save others. And though the students of Westbridge Academy would never know her name, her sacrifice ensured they would wake each morning to a world untouched by the dark. In the silence of the mirror, Clara smiled. The shadows were still. The veil held, for now.